They called his trap useless. The word carried easily through the cold Alaskan air, whispered in taverns, at docks, and around flickering lanterns when the wind howled too hard against the walls. Some laughed softly when others just shook their heads, pretending pity while hiding disbelief. A trap made of wood and sinew, of patient silence, in a place where metal and power ruled. How could that be anything but foolish? Yet the man didn't argue. He had long ago learned that words spent defending yourself to those who don't listen are words wasted. So he smiled, or perhaps it was just the tightening of his wind-burned face, adjusted the strap of his old pack, and returned to the mountain. Behind him, the trail vanished the next gust of snow, and so did the last pieces of gossip still clung to his name. He was a solitary figure, known to the few who remembered as the Trapper, though no one could recall when they first started calling him that. He had been part of the landscape for as long as most could remember, arriving with the thaw, disappearing with the freeze, his presence as predictable and unfathomable as the tide. His cabin sat high above the valley, a small structure stitched into the slope of a hill where the trees grew thin and the wind never stopped. Built with hands that had forgotten the comfort of softness, the cabin stood like an extension of the mountain itself, its walls darkened by years of storms and smoke. To anyone else, it looked like an abandoned outpost, but to him it was alive. The creaking of the timbers in the night was his company, the rhythmic drip of melting snow from the eaves calendar, and the sharp smell of spruce pitch his only perfume. Every mark on the wood told a story. Every tool in its place had a history. You could tell by looking that he had lived here not as a guest, but as a participant in the mountain's long, quiet rhythm. The villagers would sometimes catch sight of him in the early mornings when the fog rolled down from the peak. He would come down the frozen trail with a sled behind him, his beard stiff with frost, his steps deliberate and unhurried. Some said he was a ghost from another time, some a madman too proud to live among people. But the truth was simpler. He was a man who had found a kind of peace that most no longer believed existed. He came to trade salt, lamp oil, a handful of dried meat or tanned hide, and he always paid in full. He didn't talk much. When spoken to, his answers were short, but never rude. His voice quiet but steady, like someone who knew that words once couldn't be taken back. He would stand near the stove in the general store, thawing his gloves, eyes scanning the shelves, not with hunger or desire, but with awareness, as though every object told him something about the people who used it. Then, when his small errands were done, he'd nod once, thank whoever had helped him, and vanish again into the tree. Most thought he was running from something. No one goes that far into the wilderness without a reason, but they never asked directly, maybe because they didn't really want to know. The truth about a man's solitude can be too heavy to hold if you haven't carried your own. Some guessed it was heartbreak, others said war, and a few claimed he had lost his family to the cold. But none of those stories felt quite right. He didn't move like a broken man. He moved like someone who had chosen silence the way others choose prayer. The mountain had a way of stripping things down to their essentials, and he was no exception. Up there, you couldn't hide behind pride or lies. The cold had no patience for vanity. Every day was a negotiation between endurance and surrender. He knew how to read the snow, to tell by its color whether it would bear his weight or swallow him whole. He knew which trees bent before they broke, which hollows would fill with drift before the night came. His hands carried the memory of thousands of small tasks done alone, setting a snare, splitting wood, mending the torn lining of his coat. These things made up the quiet arithmetic of survival. Then came the winter that changed everything. It started softly, like any other, but by mid-season, the sky had turned a strange shade of iron and stayed that way for weeks. The air itself grew heavier, the kind of cold that burned through wool and leather, settling deep in the bones. Even the river that always murmured beneath its crust of ice went silent. The animals disappeared. The forest, once filled with the whisper of wings and tracks, became a white desert. The trapper felt it first in his gut, that shift in the balance of things. He knew the mountain was preparing to test. He spent days checking his traps, most of them empty, and nights tending to the small fire that refused to die. The storm came. It came without warning. Snow-driven, the wind like claws tearing at cabin walls. For 2 days, he stayed feeding the fire and listening. On the third morning, the wind sighed much, and he knew he had to. He packed what he needed: rope, his knife, a bit of dried fish, a trap the villagers called useless. It was a strange thing, the trap, more art than mechanism. It didn't snap, crush. It guided. Made from bent spruce, sinew, and carved stakes, it was built not to overpower, but to persuade. He had studied animals long enough to understand that the best traps don't fight nature, they work with it. The mountain had taught him that. He hauled the sled up a narrow ravine where the cliffs funneled the wind like a breath. He knew this place well. The snow there drifted deep, a scent of bait traveled far. He set the trap carefully, whispering almost unconsciously as he worked. Not words exactly, but sounds of attention, like one might make when coaxing a nervous creature to stay still. Then he waited. Hours turned to dusk. The snow came again, lighter now, falling straight down, cloaking him in a stillness that blurred the edges of time. He didn't shiver, he barely moved. To live alone in the mountains, to learn the language patience, to understand that stillness wasn't empty, it was full of meaning. By the second day, his firewood was low, and the cold crept up his legs like water. He slept in short bursts, his back pressed against the sled, his breath forming small clouds that froze in his beard. In the moments between sleep and waking, he thought about people in the village, about their laughter when they called his work useless. He felt no bitterness. He understood why most people no longer trusted things they couldn't measure or explain. They needed proof before they believed, and the mountain didn't give proof easily. When he rose again, pale light was spilling through the storm's remnants, a thin promise of dawn. The wind had shifted. He went to check the trap, his boots breaking the crusted snow with a soft crack. For a long while he saw nothing. Then the surface ahead of him rippled as if something beneath the snow had moved, stopped breathing. There, caught gently within the frame of his trap, was life. A great animal, wild and desperate, its strength half hidden by exhaustion. It had not been harmed. The trap had done what it was meant to do. God, destroy. He murmured softly, calming it, his hand steady as he moved to free it. The creature's eyes met his for a moment, an exchange too brief and ancient to describe. When it was done, he knelt beside it, whispering thanks, not out of superstition, but respect. Then he began the long trek back. 3 days later, he came down the trail again, pulling his sled. The villagers saw him first as a dark line against the snow, then as a man bowed under weight, but not weakness. Behind him, beneath the tarp, was what the storm had given him. A massive caribou, strong and fat, enough to feed the entire settlement for a week. The people stared, silent at first, and one by one they came closer. The old men who had laughed before said nothing. The women looked at the sled and then at him, eyes soft with gratitude. He didn't make a speech or ask for praise. He just nodded and said, "The mountain gave more than I needed." And that was all. They butchered the animal together, smoked the meat, rendered the fat, and stored what was left in the communal shed. For the first time that winter, no one went hungry. That night, as the wind quieted and the stars returned, the villagers spoke of him in a new way. They called him wise, maybe even blessed. Some said the mountain had chosen him. Others said his trap had been touched by luck, but he knew better. It wasn't luck. It was listening. The mountain had been teaching him all along. It was they who hadn't been listening. Thaw came months later. He vanished again, returning to his cabin as he always. The story of his trap spread with the meltwater, told and retold until it became something larger than fact. They began calling it the trapper's gift, and though many tried to copy it, none could make it work the same way. They didn't understand that it wasn't about the trap at all. It was about the man who had built it and the silence he had learned to. I often think about how he lived by the rhythm of wind and snow, about how he seemed to exist in a world stripped of noise. Maybe that's why his story lingered. Because somewhere inside us, there's still a hunger for that kind of honesty, to live by skill instead of pretense, by awareness instead of noise, to be part of the land instead of merely walking across it. And maybe, as you listen to his story now, you feel a small echo of that same call, the one that leads some people to the mountain and others quiet places in their own heart. Maybe that's why you're here, listening, wondering what it would be like to step away from the noise for a while and find your own silence. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Somewhere deep in the city lights, or somewhere where the snow still remembers the sound of wind? There was time before the mountain, though few would believe it if they had seen him as he was now. The man who had learned to sleep with the wind as his blanket and the stars as his clock, had once known a world of noise, of light, and of people who spoke without listening. Back then, his hands were clean and his eyes restless. He lived near the edge of a harbor town far to the south, where the sea never froze and where the sound of engine never stopped. He had been a fisherman first, or something close to it, working the docks for a living that was never quite enough to fill the space inside him. The sea had its own kind of silence, but it wasn't the same. It was a restless, churning quiet, full of motion and salt smell of decay. You could love it, you could never rest in it. He had a small house then, with windows that faced the water and a wooden chair on the porch. He'd sit at night, staring at the horizon. People knew him by name. They called out to him when he passed, shared drinks with him at the tavern, spoke about weather and boats, the cost of bait. He smiled and nodded, said what was polite, and yet always there was a distance in his gaze, as though he was already watching a world that others couldn't see. Some said he was lonely. Maybe he was. But there's a kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people, forgotten what quiet means. He had loved once, rarely thought about it. Her name had faded his memory, softened by time, footprints, and melting snow. She was kind, that much he remembered, and she had a way of talking about life as though it were something to be shaped by will and loan. He admired her for that. They had built plans together once, small, fragile plans like every young couple does. A better boat, a bigger house, a child perhaps, someday when there was enough saved. But life has a way of testing promise faster than love can fulfill them. The sea turned cruel that year, and work grew thin. There were nights he didn't come home, nights she sat by the window waiting, the lamp burning low. When he did return, his silence filled the room until even her laughter. Then came the storm, the one that took more than boats and net. It came without warning, the kind that tears apart not only the harbor, but the hearts of those who depend on it. The waves that night were taller than their sound, louder than thunder. He had gone out with two others, men he'd known all his life. Only he came back. They found him clinging to a broken oar near the rocks at dawn, his body blue from the cold, his eyes wide and empty. The others were never found. He spent days afterward walking the shore, searching for any sign, as if the sea might offer an explanation if he looked long enough. It never. Grief doesn't speak. It listens. And in that silence, something inside him began to unravel. After that, he couldn't stand the sound of the harbor anymore, the laughter, the music, even the creak of the dock. All of it reminded him of what the sea had taken and what it had left. He tried to stay for a while, tried to find meaning again in the familiar rhythm of work, but every time he looked out at the horizon, he saw not beauty, but accusation. The sea had taught him something he could never unlearn, that life is fragile, and that most people move through it pretending it wasn't. He envied them for that ignorance, but he couldn't share it anymore. His silence became heavier than words, and people began to avoid him. They didn't mean harm. They just didn't know what to say to a man who had stopped tending. One day, he packed a bag and left. No goodbyes, no just a quiet walk down the pier at dawn. The same way he had walked it 1,000 times before, except this time he didn't turn back. He traveled north, following the cold. It was as if he was drawn to it, pulled by some invisible thread. The farther he went, the more the world seemed to fade, towns growing smaller, roads turning to gravel, then to dirt, then to nothing at all. He reached a place where maps ended, where the sky felt close enough to touch, and there he stopped. The mountains rose ahead of him, immense, indifferent, and he felt something shift inside him, a strange calm, almost like relief. The silence he had been running from became the silence he had been seeking all along. At first, life there was harder than anything he had known. The body doesn't adapt to solitude as easily as the heart does. He built a small shelter from logs, then rebuilt it when the first storm tore it apart. He learned to start fires with wet wood, to find food where there seemed to be none, to track animals by the faintest marks of snow. Every day was a lesson, and every mistake was a teacher. Hunger, cold, exhaustion, they were not enemies, but instructors. The mountain stripped him down to his essential, taking from him everything that wasn't necessary until only what was real remained. He often thought about people during those first months, but not with regret. More with curiosity, as if observing another species from afar. He wondered why they built so much, only to fill their lives with noise, why they sought comfort and yet ran from the discomfort that taught them who they were. Out here, there was no hiding from yourself. The land reflected you back with perfect honesty. If you were angry, it gave you storm. If you were patient, it gave you quiet. And if you listened long enough, it gave you understanding. He began to see patterns in the way the ravens flew ahead of bad weather, the way the river sounded different before it froze, the way the sky at dusk carried a hue that meant the next morning would bring wind. The mountain was alive in ways most people couldn't imagine. It spoke not in words, but in shifts of light and temperature, in silence and sound. The longer he stayed, the more fluent he became in its language. Loneliness turned into company. Hunger turned into gratitude. What others would call isolation, he called clarity. Years passed like that, seasons folding into each other, snow melting into river, summer giving way to firelight and frost again. Time became circular, not linear. He didn't count the years anymore. He measured them in the depth of snow, the fatness of the salmon, the return of birds in spring. Sometimes he would go months without seeing another human face. When he did descend to the village, it felt like stepping into another world. The sounds were too sharp, the voices too fast. He always left sooner than he intended. The villagers grew used to his visits, his quiet calm, his strange wisdom that seemed older than his age. They started to treat him with a mix of respect and superstition, as though he was a bridge between worlds. Maybe in some way he was. He never spoke of his past. When people asked where he had come from, he would simply say, "Far enough," and that was enough for them. They saw in his eyes that he had walked through something most could not understand. The kind of loss that doesn't end but changes shape until it becomes part of you. They didn't need details. They could feel the truth in his silence. Over time, his cabin filled with small reminders of his journey. A smooth stone from the river, a broken antler, a piece of driftwood that somehow made its way inland. Each item was a story, a conversation with the land. He kept them not as trophies, but as companions. In the evenings, when the light dimmed and the fire burned low, he would sit with those objects, running his hands over their surface, feeling the connection between what had been and what was. The world beyond the mountains faded from his mind until it felt like another lifetime, a dream he had once dreamed and then outgrown. And yet, even in his peace, there were moments when memory reached a smell, a sound, the way the snow glittered in the sunlight. Sometimes it pulled him back to that night on the sea. He could still hear the roar of the storm, still feel the weight of his friend's hands slipping away in the dark. Instead of pain, there was acceptance. The mountain had taught him that loss was not something to escape, but something to understand. Everything changes form. The sea had taken, yes, but it had also given. It had sent him north, to a place where silence was not emptiness, fullness, where grief became gratitude. He no longer blamed the storm, nor the sea, nor fate. He saw now that everything that had happened, every wound, every mistake, had been part of a long road leading him here. If he had not lost, he would never have found. That was the strange mercy of the wilderness. It stripped away illusion till only truth remained. Sometimes, when he looked down from the ridge and saw the village lights flicker below, he wondered if people there ever thought of him, if they imagined him lonely or mad. Perhaps they did, but he felt no need to explain himself. A man doesn't need to justify the peace he's earned. He had come to understand something most people spend their lives chasing, that happiness is not a place, possession, but a state of attention. To wake each day and see the mountain anew, to survive by grace, skill, to live small, but live real, that was enough. And perhaps that is why, when they called his trap useless, he didn't mind, because he had once been called useless himself by a world that couldn't understand the language he had chosen to live by. The world measures success by noise and motion. The mountain measures it by stillness and persistence. He had chosen the right teacher. He would sit sometimes at dusk on the step of his cabin, watching the sky bleed into violet and ash. The wind would brush through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of snow, and he would close his eye, breathing it in. Somewhere far away, people were arguing, rushing, building, destroying. But here, only the quiet moved. He had become part of something larger, something unbroken. In the mountain silence, he had found his own. If you've ever felt the weight of noise pressing on you, if you've ever wondered what it would feel like to just step away from, you might understand him a little now. There's a place in every heart that longs for same stillness. Maybe that's why stories like his stay with us, because they remind us of something we've forgotten, still remember in our bones. And if you're listening now, somewhere far from the snow, maybe take a moment to breathe and imagine cold air filling your lungs, the crackle of a fire, the slow heartbeat of the earth beneath you. That's the sound he heard every night, the one that healed him more than words ever could. If you made it this far into his story, I hope you'll stay a while longer. There's more yet. And if you want to keep walking beside him through this quiet, frozen world, make sure you don't lose your place. Subscribe in your own way to this journey so you can follow him deeper into the mountain's heart. When we continue, he had lived in the mountain long enough, the season no longer. They didn't arrive with sudden changes, clear boundaries anymore. They drifted into each old memory, blending at the edges. The silence that once felt vast and foreign had become familiar, almost tender, like the pause between heartbeats. Each sound meant something. The creak of the ice expanding in the night, the crackle of sap and burning wood, the flutter of wings as a raven passed overhead. In the beginning, those sounds had kept him company. Later, it became his language. He spoke through them, to them, and perhaps, in a way, through himself. Life in silence does not mean the absence of sound. It means that sound has been purified. Out here, far from the human world, there was no clutter of engine or chatter or the hum of things built to fill emptiness. There was only what was a man's breath, the shifting of snow under his boots, the soft murmur of water beneath ice. In that simplicity, he began to hear not only the mountain, but his own mind again. The noise that people carry inside, The regrets, comparison, the endless small thoughts slowly faded, static, and the signal clears. What remained was something deeper, sharper. Awareness. He rose before dawn every day, not because he needed to, but because the first light. It was the only time the world seemed truly at peace. When even the air held it, he would step out, wrapped in fur and leather, and stand on small ledge cabin. From there, he could see the valley stretching below him, white and endless, the peaks beyond painted faint pink by the rising sun. In that quiet, he felt part of something vast and ancient, something that didn't care for his name or his story, accepted him anyway. That was freedom, the kind no man could buy. His days followed a rhythm older than memory. Each morning, he checked the traps he had set them before, not out of greed, but gratitude. Every animal he caught was treated. He took only what he needed, never more. He had learned long ago that taking more than your share, even when no one sees, leaves a mark on and on your soul. He skinned each creature carefully, murmuring his thanks to still air, then tanned the hides, stored the meat. His life was measured not in abundance, but in balance. Some winters were lean, others generous, but he never went hungry. The mountain always gave enough to those who listened. In the long afternoons, when the sun hung low and the wind swept fine snow into silver veils, he would repair tools, mend his boots, or carve small shapes from driftwood. His hands were strong, and the carvings that filled his shelves were not decorations, but reminders. Wolves, ravens, salmon, all the creatures that shared the mountain with him. He carved them not as trophies, but as prayers, each one a way of saying, I see you, I understand, we are both part of this. He never sold them or gave them away. They were his only company that didn't need words. There were nights, though, when the silence pressed harder, when the fire burned low and the wind outside moaned like something alive. He would feel the old memories stir, the harbor, the storm, the faces he had lost. They came not as ghosts to torment him, but as echoes reminding him of what had once mattered. He didn't push them away anymore. He would sit by the fire, eyes half closed, and let the past move through him like smoke. Time, he had learned, doesn't heal by erasing. It heals by softening the edges, by teaching you how to carry the weight differently. Out here, where there was no one to lie to, he could finally tell himself the truth. He had forgiven everything, even himself. When the thaw came, the river woke first. You could hear it beneath the ice, a faint rumble like distant thunder. The snow began to sag on the branches, the sky turned pale blue, and the first drops of meltwater glistened in the sun. The mountain came alive again. The bears emerged hungry and slow. The foxes danced along the ridges, and the air filled with birds returning from far away. The trapper moved more lightly then, his steps quick, easy. He would spend hours following tracks just to see where they led, not to hunt, but to learn. Every trail was a story, every print a sentence in the language of the wild. In the summer, when the days stretched endlessly and the nights barely brushed the edge of darkness, he would walk for miles beyond his usual boundaries. He explored new valleys, crossed rivers, and sometimes climbed high enough to see the sea again, far in the distance, shimmering like a memory. From that height, the world seemed peaceful, almost innocent. He could feel the wind against his face, sharp and clean, and for a moment he would think of the life he had left behind, not with sadness, but with understanding. The man he had been back then could not have survived here. It was only through loss that he had become strong enough to belong to the mountain. Sometimes he found traces of other people, old cabins half collapsed, rusted traps, broken sled runners. He would stop and study them, wondering who those men had been, what had brought them here, and whether they had ever found what they were looking for. He never touched their remains. It felt wrong to disturb what the mountain had already claimed. Instead, he whispered a quiet wish for them, the same one he often spoke to the wind for himself. May you rest silent, sought. The few times he met other trappers, the encounters were brief and wordless. They would nod, exchange a look of recognition, and move on. Among men like him, silence was not distant, it was respect. There was no need for stories. Their lives were written in the same snow, their lessons carved by the same cold. He sometimes traded pelts or shared a fire, but he always returned alone, drawn back to his cabin, tied ashore. Solitude's a wound, become his refuge. In the deep of winter, when the world narrowed again to white and shadow, he entered a kind of stillness few can imagine. The days were short, the nights long, and filled with whispers of ice shifting in the dark. He would rise, split wood, feed his fire, cook simple meals, then sit by the small window watching snow fall endless. The mind quiets differently in that kind of isolation. At first, it resists. It wants distraction, comfort, stories to fill the hours. Slowly, it surrenders. It begins to see beauty in the smallest, the curl of smoke rising from a cup of tea, the shimmer of frost catching the lamplight, the way your own breath moves in rhythm with the wind outside, the boundary between self and world, and you realize you were never at all. He often spoke aloud then, not to anyone, but to the silence. He would talk to the fetid, to the river as it groaned under the ice, to the trees as they bent under snow. "You're still here," he would say softly, "and so am I." That was enough. Some nights he would tell stories, fragments of his past, pieces of dreams, bits of old songs half remembered. His voice would echo in the cabin, warm and low, mixing with the crackle of the flames. It didn't matter that no one heard. The mountain heard, and that was all he needed. There's a kind of wisdom that grows only in silence. It isn't learned through books or taught by teachers. It comes from watching the world without trying to control it, from living close enough to the elements that you start to see their rhythm reflected in yourself. He began to understand things about people, too, even though he realized most suffering comes from resistance, from wanting the world to be it isn't. The mountain never resists a storm. It lets it. The trees bend and the snow falls, melts. Everything accepts its part in the cycle. When he thought of his old life, he saw now that he had spent years fighting what was. The storm on the sea had not ruined him. His resistance to it had. When the loneliness did come, it wasn't sadness, it was gratitude in disguise. It reminded him that he was still human, still capable of missing something. On those nights, he would light an extra lamp and sit by the window, watching the aurora ripple. The colors moved like smoke, green and violet, so alive they seemed to breathe. He would imagine that maybe somewhere far beyond the mountains, someone else was watching the same light, feeling the same smallness. In that thought, years, quiet, full, complete. The villages below saw him less and less, spoke of him more often. Children grew up hearing stories about the man who lived with the mountain, the one who spoke to the wind and caught food without killing more than he needed. Some said he could predict storms, others that he could calm them. He never tried to correct any of it. Legends, he knew, were just ways people made sense of what they didn't yet understand. And if his solitude gave them comfort or hope, then let them believe. Every time he descended to trade in the village, the air felt different, heavy with the scent of fuel and noise. He would exchange his furs for salt and oil, nod politely to the few who greeted him, then retreat before anyone could ask too much. But one thing had changed. No one called his trap useless. In fact, some had started trying to build their own versions of it, though none worked quite the same. They didn't realize that what made his trap powerful wasn't its design, the silence it was born from. A man cannot create what he doesn't first understand. His trap worked because it was an extension of his listening, his patience, his faith in the mountain. Back in his cabin, he would smile faintly at the thought, not out of pride, but out of humility. He never felt that the trap had made him wise. It was the other way around. Wisdom had made the trap. And so life continued, quietly, faithfully, beautifully, simple. He had everything he needed: fire, food, the company of wind and light. There were no clocks, no schedules, only the steady rhythm of existence. Sometimes, when he woke in the night and stepped outside, the stars above seemed close enough to touch. He would stand there for long minutes, breathing the frozen, feeling it beat in the river. It was in those moments that he understood the full meaning of silence, not emptiness, fullness, not the absence of life, but the presence of everything at once. If you've ever longed for that kind of quiet, you know what he felt, the pull towards something simpler, more real, a place where nothing needs to be said because everything already speaks. Maybe that's why his story, not because it's about a man surviving the wild, but because it's about a man remembering how to live. It was deep winter again when the challenge came, the kind of winter that seemed to stop time itself. The snow had fallen for 9 days straight without pause, burying everything in silence. Even the river, which always managed to whisper beneath its frozen skin, had gone mute. The air was so still that when he exhaled, the sound of his breath seemed loud enough to echo off the mountain. He had lived through many winters, but there was something different. It carried an edge, a heaviness, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting for something unseen. The trapper felt it in his bones, in the quiet warnings of the birds that left too early, in the way the fox stopped crossing open ground. The mountain was changing, and it wanted to see if he could still listen. He woke one morning to find the cold deeper than he had ever felt it. The cabin walls creaked, the windows filmed over with frost thick as glass. His breath hung in the air long after he moved. He lit the fire, but even the flames seemed hesitant, their warmth swallowed quickly by the freezing air. He stepped outside, boots sinking into snow that reached almost to his knees, and looked towards the horizon. The world was white, an endless, blinding plain beneath a sky that had forgotten the color blue. It was beautiful and terrible. His first thought was for the traps he had set 3 days earlier down by the ridge. He knew if he didn't reach them soon, the snow would bury them for good. He packed his sled, strapped on his snowshoes, and started down the narrow trail that wound between the trees. Every step was work. The snow resisted him, the wind stung his face, and his hands numbed despite the layers of fur. Yet he moved steadily, each breath measured, each motion deliberate. In the silence of that vast white world, he could hear only the crunch of his steps, slow beat of his heart. It reminded him of why he had come here in the first place, to be part of something that didn't care for convenience or comfort, but for truth. The first trap he found was empty, buried beneath a drift so deep he almost missed it. The second had been sprung but held nothing but a tuft of fur, a sign that something escaped. He smiled faintly, brushing the snow away. The mountain took and gave as it pleased. That was its law. When he reached the third trap, the one set near the mouth of the ravine, he paused. Something felt wrong. The air there was different, heavy with a scent he didn't recognize. The snow was disturbed, pressed down in wide arcs, as if something massive through. He crouched, gloved fingers tracing the edges of the track. They were larger than any he had seen, too wide for a wolf, too long for a bear. The claw marks were deep, deliberate. Whatever had come through this way wasn't just big, it was ancient. He followed the trail slowly, every sense sharpened by instinct. It led down into the ravine, where the snow hung heavy on the trees, the light dimmed faint silver. He moved carefully, pausing often to listen. There was a sound beneath the wind now, a low rhythm like breathing. When he reached the bend in the ravine, he saw a great lying half buried beneath snow, broken branches. At first, he thought it was a fallen log. Then the creature was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was a moose, but larger than any living memory, with antlers that spread wider than his cabin roof and fur thick as bark. Its eyes, dark and glassy, met his for a moment before it tried to rise and failed, the snow collapsing beneath its massive body. It had been caught not in his trap, but by the storm, pinned by ice exhaustion. He could see that one of its legs was twisted, broken, likely from a fall higher up the ridge. It had struggled down here for shelter, only to be trapped by the weight of the mountain snow. The man stood there a long while, silent, his breath rising. The animal's strength was failing, but its spirit still alive, fierce, proud. To kill it would be mercy, to leave it would be cruelty. Yet he hesitated, because something in its eyes reminded him of himself. He set down his pack and moved closer, speaking softly, though he knew it couldn't understand his words. The sound of his voice seemed to calm it. He could see now that it was dying, but not yet ready to surrender. He took out his knife and stepped forward, but then stopped again. The knife hung in his hand, heavy as a stone. He realized that what stood before him was more than an animal. It was a messenger, Tess. The mountain was watching to see what kind of man he had become. So he did something that even he didn't expect. He sheathed the knife, cleared the snow around the moose's body, and began working to free it. For hours he dug, his arms burning, sweat freezing against his skin. The wind bit at him, the light faded. Still he cut branches, built a small fire nearby, and melted snow to pour over the ice, locking the animal's leg. It groaned once, a deep rumbling sound seemed to ground. He didn't speak again, only worked harder, faster. Finally, the great creature moved, shifting its weight and struggling to stand. When it did, it towered above him, steam rising from its body like smoke. For a moment, man and beast stood face to face, neither afraid, both exhausted, both alive. Then the moose turned and limped away into the trees, leaving him alone in the falling snow. He stayed by the dying fire until night came, body trembling with fatigue. Above him, the stars returned, sharp and clear. After days of storm, he felt something inside him loosen, as if a knot had finally come undone. In freeing the animal, he had freed something within himself, the last remnants of the man who still believed survival was about conquering. It wasn't. It was about harmony, about knowing when to act, when to yield, and when to simply witness. The mountain had never wanted his strength. It had wanted his humility. When he returned to the village days later, stared as they always did, but this time their eyes were wide not with doubt, with wonder. They had heard stories already. Someone had found the tracks of the enormous moose near the lure trails, limp, evident, but alive. They said the creature had become a legend among hunters, spirit of endurance that would watch over those who the land. When they told him this, he didn't tell them that he had looked into its eye. Some things belonged to silence. The following weeks passed quietly. The cold deepened, but he felt lighter than he had in years. He spent long hours sitting outside his cabin, watching the horizon where the white met the sky. The world seemed gentler somehow, as if the mountain itself had accepted him more fully. One evening, as he prepared his small meal, he noticed movement near the tree line, a shadow, then another. He stood, hand instinctively going to his knife, but stopped when he saw what it was. The moose had returned. It stood there, watching him from a distance, its antlers rimmed with frost, its breath misting in the cold air. It didn't move closer, and neither did he. They simply watched each other until the light faded. It turned and disappeared again into the forest. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. He knew what it meant. The mountain had spoken, and it was that night. As he sat by the fire, he thought about the meaning of the encounter. For years, he had believed the mountain's lessons came through struggle, through hardship and survival. But now he understood that its greatest lessons came through mercy, the ability to care for something other than yourself, to recognize the shared pulse of life in all things. That was what made a man worthy. The trapper had learned that his real trap wasn't built from wood or sinew. It was built from patience, empathy, and stillness. That was the secret that had always been misunderstood by others. His so-called useless trap was never about catching. It was about releasing. Word of his deed spread quietly, as things do in small places. The villagers began leaving small gifts by the edge of the trail, jars of honey, bits of cloth, salt wrapped in paper. They never saw him take them, but by morning the offerings were always gone. In return, they found tracks near their homes where food had been scarce or pelts left near their door. They began to say the trapper had made a pact with the mountain, that he lived under its. He smiled at the thought, though he knew the truth was simpler. The mountain didn't protect anyone. It simply mirrored them. And what it now reflected back to him, peace. When spring came, the snow melted faster than usual. The river sang again, wild and clear, and the air filled with scent and movement. He spent days walking along the banks, collecting stones shaped by the thaw, watching the world wake up. The moose never returned again, but he felt it everywhere, in the distant tremor of the earth. Sometime he wondered if it had been the mountain simply shown him it did. The truth was not in the memory, but in the change it left behind. He had faced many storms, but that winter had been the greatest of them, not because of its cruelty, but because of its gift. It had shown him that strength without compassion is just another form of weakness. The challenge wasn't surviving the cold. It was surviving the self that still believed solitude meant separation. The discovery was realizing that everything, every gust of wind, every falling snowflake, every living thing was part of the same breath. As he sat on his porch that spring, watching the snow retreat and the green return, he felt something close to joy, not loud, not fleeting, but quiet, steady, like the pulse of the earth itself. He had nothing to prove, nothing to gain, nothing to lose. The mountain he finally, and maybe that's why his story still matters, because every life, whether lived among people or among peaks, holds its own test, its own moment when we must choose between force and grace. Some fail, some flee, but a few, just a few, learn to listen. He was one of them. If you've come this far with him, perhaps you're meant to hear this part too. The world rewards speed, noise, and ambition, but the mountain rewards stillness. If you want to walk this path further, to keep hearing his story and what came after, take a quiet step closer. Subscribe, stay with me in this silence, and let's go on together when the next wind rises. By the time the next winter came, the trapper had lived so long in the silence the world below began to feel like a story he had once heard long ago and mostly forgotten. The sounds of men, their cities, and their machines were memories now, faint and unreal, like echoes sometimes from a dream. When the wind blew just right, he thought he could almost hear the hum of distant engines, the whisper of voices carried from far away, but he knew it was only his imagination playing tricks on him. The mountain was his world now, and in that world he had found something no town, harbor could give him. Clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes when all the noise is stripped away, leaving behind the raw hum of life itself. He had stopped keeping track of years. Seasons were enough. They told him everything he needed to know. The deep snows meant rest and endurance. The thaw meant patience and renewal. Spring was the quiet promise of life's return, and summer, though short, was abundance purest form. He had come to understand that the mountain's rhythm was not so different from a man. You are born, you grow, you struggle, you fade, you begin again in some form. Watching it all unfold season after season, he saw himself reflected in the cycle. The way the world lets go without complaint, without drama. It taught him what peace really meant. There were days when he sat for hours doing nothing but watching the clouds move. That might seem like idle to some, but to him it was prayer. He didn't pray to any god in particular. The mountain itself, the sky above him, was his cathedral, the snow his altar, the wind his hymn. He didn't ask for anything in those silent prayers. He simply gave thanks. Thanks for the warmth of fire, the taste of clean water, the steady thrum of his heart still beating despite the years. He had learned that gratitude was not a feeling to chase, but a way of seeing. In his silence, he began to think differently about people, not with bitterness as he once had, but with a kind of soft understanding. He realized that the same restlessness that had once driven him away from the world was still driving those who stayed within it. People feared silence not because it was empty, but because it was honest. When everything grows quiet, you begin to hear yourself clearly, and most people aren't ready for that. They hide from it behind their noise, their busyness, their endless talking. He had done the same once. The mountain had simply taken all that away from him and refused to give it back until he learned how to be still inside his own mind. He often wondered what the world was becoming beyond the valley. When he thought of it, it wasn't with judgment, with sorrow. He imagined more lights, more roads, more noise, and less listening. He had seen what happens when men believe they are separate from nature. They build walls to keep out the cold, only to find that they have trapped themselves inside their own emptiness. They destroy the land trying to own it, forgetting that what they own eventually owns them. Out here, in the slow rhythm of ice and thaw, he saw how foolish that was. The mountain owed no man anything, yet it gave freely to those who respected. That was the balance, the quiet law of all life, and he couldn't help but wonder when the rest of the world had forgotten. Sometimes he thought about going back, if only to see what had become of the harbor and the people he once knew. The thought always vanished quickly, replaced by calm certainty. There was nothing left for him there, not because it had changed, but because he had. He no longer needed what the world promised. He had found something far greater and far simpler. Enough. The word had become sacred to him. Enough food, enough warmth, enough peace. The kind of contentment that doesn't depend on having more, but on needing less. He realized that most of the suffering in the world came from forgetting that one word. When he did think of people, he thought of them kindly. He imagined them walking under streetlights, wrapped in coats against the rain, hurrying through lives that never seemed to slow down. He hoped they would find a moment, just one, to stop and breathe, to hear the world again. Maybe they would see the same truth he had found in the cold, that silence, not the absence of life, the doorway to it. He had begun keeping a journal again, though not in the way he once had. The pages were made of thin bark, the ink a mixture of soot and melted. His handwriting was rough, uneven, steady. He didn't write about events anymore. He wrote about moments, the taste of cold air at dawn, about the way the moonlight fell across the river, about the quiet that followed a snowstorm. He wrote for no one but himself, and perhaps for the mountain, as if trying to return the words it had given him. Today, the wind, one line. It sounded forgiveness. Another said, a man becomes free when he no longer wants to be seen. There was wisdom in that, but also even loneliness can feel heavy when there is no one to share it. Sometimes, in the depth of night, he caught himself speaking aloud, telling the fire stories as if it were an old friend. He would describe the first cabin he built, the storm that nearly broke him, the great moose that looked into his. The flames flickered as if listening, and he felt comforted. It wasn't madness. It was communion. Everything around him was alive, and in that aliveness, he was never truly alone. One night, during the late autumn, he awoke to a strange glow outside. He stepped out of his cabin and saw the northern lights burning brighter than he had ever seen them. Curtains of green and violet rippled across the sky, so vivid they painted the snow in color. He stood there for a long time, eyes wide, breath held, overwhelmed by beauty. The silence was absolute, the air still as glass. In that moment, he felt something stir deep within him, a kind of memory that didn't belong to his mind but to his soul. He realized that what he was seeing wasn't just light in the sky. It was the heartbeat of the earth made visible. The same energy that burned in those burned in him. He was not. He never had been. He laughed softly then, not out of joy or madness, but out of awe. It was the laughter of understanding. The next morning, He found the first frost of the new season glittering across the valley. He walked down to the river, cracked the ice with his hands, and washed his face in the freezing water. The cold bit into him sharp and alive. It felt like a baptism, a renewal. He thought about all the people who would never feel this, who would live their entire lives without ever touching something so raw, so real. He wished he could tell them that peace was not found in safety, but in surrender. That life does not need to be controlled to be beautiful. But he knew his words would sound strange to, maybe even foolish. The truth, he realized, was something each person had to find on their own. The mountain could only call. It could not drag anyone to it. As the day warmed, he hiked the ridge above his cabin, a place he hadn't visited in years. The climb was steep, but his legs were strong, his lungs steady. When he reached the top, the world opened before him. The valley, the frozen river, the endless stretch of peaks fading into blue distance. He stood there a long while, the wind tugging at his coat, the sky wide above. He thought of how far he had come, not in miles, spirit. Once he had been a man who fought storms. Now he was part of them. Once he had meaning. Now he simply lived. He sat down on a flat rock, took a piece of bread from his pocket, and ate slowly, watching the light change on the snow. Below him, the forest shimmered, alive with quiet movement. He felt a sudden wave of gratitude so deep it brought tears to his eyes, not for anything specific, everything, for the air, the cold, the silence, the endless mystery of it all. The world, he thought, asks for nothing but respect. Give it that, and it gives everything back. When he finally rose to leave, he turned one last time to look at the horizon. "Thank you," he whispered, though he didn't know if he was speaking to the mountain, to life, or to the version of himself who had once been lost. Maybe all three. The wind answered with a long and for a moment he thought he heard something like words in it, not in sound, but in feeling. It said, "You've listened well." That night, back in his cabin, he added one final line to his journal before the fire went out. "The mountain is not a place," he wrote. "It is a way of being, and once it teaches you how to see, you carry it wherever you go." He closed the book, placed it beside his bed, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who has nothing left to prove. If you followed him this far, you might feel it too, that quiet pull toward something simpler, truer. The world keeps growing louder, but the lesson of the mountain remains the same. Silence is not your enemy, it's your mirror. When you learn to look into it without fear, you start to see who you really are. And if you want to keep walking this path, stay close. There's one more part to tell, the silence and the legacy it leaves behind. But for now, breathe with the mountain a moment longer. Let its quiet settle into you. Then, when you're ready, we'll go to the end together. In the last years of his life, the mountain and the man became indistinguishable. His tracks were part of the landscape. His cabin, a mark on the slope that blended so perfectly with the trees that even the hunters from the village sometimes walked past it without notice. The logs had darkened with age. The roof bowed slightly under the weight of many winters, but the fire inside still burned. Smoke rose thin and steady from the chimney, even on the coldest mornings, and those who saw it from below would nod quietly, knowing he was still there. They spoke of him not with curiosity anymore, but with reverence. He had become a legend, though he had never asked to be one. Time had gentled him. His hair, once black as spruce bark, had turned the color of ash. His beard reached his chest. His hands were lined and scarred, but his movements remained steady, his eye clear. The mountain had carved him into itself. He had grown thin and weathered, but also calm in a way that no man of the lowlands could ever be. He no longer sought food in abundance, nor warmth beyond what the fire offered. He lived each day as if it were both the first and the last, knowing that everything he needed had already been given. Winter came again, slow and deep. It began with quiet snowfall, then grew into a white silence stretched across the land. The trapper welcomed it the way one welcomes an old friend. He prepared his firewood, checked the roof, set his traps in the usual. But this year, something felt different. The air carried a softness that wasn't weakness, but completion. Even the wind seemed to move around him more gently, as though it too understood. He moved slower now, stopping often to rest, yet there was no sense of struggle. Every step felt like a conversation with the earth beneath him, every breath a memory. He spent most of his days sitting near the window, watching the light shift over the valley. Sometimes he carved, sometimes he wrote, but mostly he simply watched. The snow fell endlessly, changing shape, but never perfect. He saw the patterns in everything, the way each flake was unique, but still part of the same design, the way each day passed, yet never really ended. Death, he had come to understand, was not a disappearance, but a return. The same way water returns to the sea, a man returns to the silence it created. One morning he woke before dawn and felt an unusual stillness in his chest. It was pain. It was more like understanding. He rose, dressed slowly, and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to bite, but he didn't mind. Sky above was clear, filled with stars that seemed closer than ever before. The world below shimmered in the faint light, untouched, perfect. He stood there for a long time, breathing it all in, feeling the sharp sting of life in his lungs. The sound of the wind was faint, almost kind. He smiled faintly, as though the mountain had just whispered something he had been waiting his whole life to hear. He knew then that his time was near, not as fear, not as sadness, but as completion. He returned to his cabin and fed the fire one last time. He made tea, sipped it slowly, and opened his journal. The pages were nearly full now, filled with years of thought, of observation, of gratitude. He turned to a blank page and began to write, his hand steady despite the cold. "If anyone finds this," he began, "know that I lived a good life. I had food when I was hungry, warmth when I was cold, and peace when I stopped asking for anything else. The mountain gave me everything I needed because I learned to need little. If you read these words, take them as a promise that silence can love you if you let it. The world is not against you. It is waiting for you to listen." He paused, smiled again, and wrote one last line. "Do not fear the quiet. It is where all truths begin." He set the pen down, closed the journal, and placed it beside the old carving of the moose that stood on his shelf. Then he sat back in his chair, facing the window, where dawn was beginning to rise. The first light of day poured across the snow, and for a moment it looked as though the mountain itself had caught fire. He watched it with calm eyes. The corners of his mouth still curved in peace. His breathing slowed. The warmth of the fire brushed his face, and without sound he drifted into the same silence that had been his companion all along. When spring came, the villagers noticed that the smoke no longer the chimney. Days and weeks before a few of them gathered the courage to climb the trail to his cabin. The path was still buried in snow, the trees heavy with frost, but they walked in quiet reverence. When they reached the door, they knocked softly, though none expected an answer. Inside, they found him sitting by the window, as if merely resting, his hands folded, his eyes half closed. The fire had long gone out, but the air was gentle, still holding the faint smell of wood smoke, pine. On the table beside him lay the journal, the final page open, as if he had meant for it to found. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. One of them, an old man who had known the trapper when he was young, placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Thank you." The others began to look around the cabin, the carvings, the tools, the careful order of everything, and they felt something strange in their heart. Peace, the kind of peace that doesn't belong to one man, but to everyone who remembers how to live close. They buried him on the ridge above the cabin where the view stretched endlessly across the valley. They marked the grave with a simple stone, carved only with a symbol of the mountain and the words. He listened. Every year afterward, when the snow melted, someone from the village would climb the trail to visit the place. Sometimes they brought, sometimes a piece of wood carved in his, sometimes silence. It became a ritual, not out of obligation, but gratitude. The children who grew up hearing stories about him came to believe that as long as his cabin stood, the valley would never go hungry, the storms would never last too long, and the mountain would remain kind. Over time, the stories changed, as stories always do. Some said he was a hermit who could talk to animals. Others said he had been a spirit all along, sent by the mountain to teach people how to live with it instead of against it. A few, the old ones who still remembered the truth, would smile at those tales and say, no, he was just a man who listened better than most. But even they knew that somewhere in that simplicity there was something sacred. Years passed. The cabin aged, its roof sinking, its door hanging crooked, but still it stood. Moss grew over the stones, wildflowers bloomed near the steps, and the sound of wind through the rafters became its new heart. Travelers who passed through the valley sometimes found it and spoke in whispers inside its walls, feeling the weight of something Some said they felt watched, but not by eye, by presence, by the mountain, perhaps, or by the quiet spirit of the man who had once come home. His journal was kept in the village now, preserved carefully, though its pages had begun to fade. People read it on long winter nights when the wind howled outside, the lamps flickered. His words had become a kind of scripture, not of religion, of truth. Children learned the story of the man and the mountain before they learned their letters, and every time someone read those final lines, the room grew quiet, as if the silence itself had come to listen. Sometimes strangers came from far away, hearing the story and wanting to see the place for themselves. They would climb the trail, expecting to find mystery or magic, but most found something far simpler, an old cabin, the whisper of the wind, and a silence that felt alive. Some of them cried without knowing why. Others just sat there for hours, unable to leave. What they felt had known all along, that the mountain's real gift was not survival or wisdom or it was the reminder that life at its heart is simple. You stop trying, and maybe that is the legacy he left behind. Not his traps, not his strength, but his understanding. That peace is not found in isolation, but in attention. That love is not always between people, but between a man and the world that holds him. That silence, when truly heard, is not empty, but full of meaning. He had once come to the mountain to escape, but he stayed because he discovered that he had never truly belonged anywhere else. The land had taken him in, not as a guest, but as one of its own. There's a saying among the villagers now, passed down quietly through generations. The mountain listens to those who listen to it. They say it when storms approach, when the harvest is good, when someone feels lost and needs reminding that not all strength is loud. It's their way of keeping him alive. The man whose trap had once been called useless had ended up feeding more than a village. He had fed a way of thinking, a way of seeing, a way of being. His silence become their inheritance. And perhaps, as you listen now, that silence reaches you too. Maybe you can feel a small part of it settling inside you like snow finding its place on the ground. Maybe you understand what he meant when he said that the mountain lives inside those who learn to hear it. Because that's what this story really is, a reminder that peace doesn't live in some faraway wilderness, but in the space we make within ourselves for stillness, patience, and gratitude. So before this story ends, take a moment to breathe. Listen, the same wind that brushed against his cabin still moves across the world. The same stars that watched over him now shine above you. And the same silence that carried him home is waiting for you too, whenever you choose to stop and hear. If this story has reached you, if it made you pause, even for a moment, Share that pause. Leave a trace of where you are, the way travelers once left small offerings on his trail. Tell me where you're listening from, what your sky looks like tonight. If it touched you, let someone else hear it too. Like the mountain's echo, stories only live when they are carried onward. So comment, if you will, like if it spoke to something in you. Subscribe to this quiet journey and share it so that the silence of one man in the snow might keep whispering to those who have forgotten how to listen. Because in the end, that's what he wanted, to remind the world that there is still peace waiting in the quiet, and that every one of us can find our own mountain if we only learn to be still enough to hear it.